I'm Elizabeth Ingleton, and I am the SELPA Executive Director here. And today we actually have both of our SELPAs. We have our Sonoma County Geographic SELPA and our Sonoma County Charter Partners. And I'd like to introduce my partner this afternoon or late morning, John Fisher, Program Specialist. If you could wave, John, and you'll get to hear from John a little later as we get into some of the data. I wanted to just kind of set the stage as to why the SELPA wanted to convene a session and then a Q&A to follow. And that's because it's been a different kind of pathway in special ed compliance since the pandemic. Going into the pandemic and coming out, we've had various measures from our Department of Education that have been monitored, but never with the degree that we have before us today. So what we have today is the 2021 data that will inform the 22-23 monitoring activity. And so all of our LEAs across the state of California will participate or be aware of a designation. And we're going to pull up the form, the letter form that demonstrates that. So you may be on the call today and you may not have received that CDE letter. You may not be in monitoring. Or you may be here because you sure did receive that letter and you have a specific designation that's going to be tied to an activity in the future months. So just to start, we have confirmed, our SELPA has confirmed as of March 24th that all of the letters have been delivered and copied to the SELPA. We have a comprehensive list, and that list, for your information, includes 23 LEAs from both our geographic and charter partners. So out of 74, we have 23 that will be engaged in activities. And so, of course, those folks are going to pay careful attention to this kind of information, but this is really informative because even if your LEA is not going to be doing any intentional specific level of monitoring, you are still being monitored. In other words, there are compliance and performance measures that are reported through your CalPad system that directly tie to students' experiences in your schools. So I'm going to ask John to pull up the letter, and so we'll have a visual. And I would also ask that as we go through the letter, if you have specific questions, please type them in the chat, because I'm going to start us off. I'm going to share a little bit about what the letter is intending to convey and what it leads to for your district. And then John will get into some of the disproportionality and data findings, how to review them. But I want to see the questions, and I want to make sure that if we don't have the answer today, we can follow up not only with you, but for the other districts, because my sense is your questions may be universal in nature. All right, so we're going to scroll back. There we go. This is what the letter looked like. Obviously, this has been redacted just so that we can give you an example. This does not just come from CDE. This letter is part of the Individual with Disability Education Act and the federal government's monitoring of our department in California and the data that they share nationwide as to how our students are performing and how our staff and teams that work with students are engaged in the compliant process of the IEP. So we'll scroll down a little bit further. This is a general introduction. There's a key point here. I'll have you stop, John. At the top of this page, it says 2022 Annual Determination under IDEA Part B. So let's know that this is just school age, and we know that we provide services earlier than school age, but they are not a part of this monitoring system. And then in addition to the compliance and performance, the addition of significant disproportionality is unique to California. So the DISPRO, or SIGDIS, which is often referenced for significant disproportionality, comes from litigation and significant and serious findings for the past 10 to 15 years of investigation of practices around disproportionate eligibility patterns, disproportionate discipline, data that relates to how students with disabilities are either found to be eligible under specific eligibility categories or the discipline related to their behavioral needs and supports on a school campus. So that bullet is really important in that it relates to a lot of the equity and restorative work that many of you are engaged in ensuring that as we find interventions for students, we're doing it in a manner that's reflective and sensitive to culture, race, ethnicity, and in particular discipline. So lots there, but this is unique to California. The next section of the letter talks about the actual determination. So there's 4 possible ways a district will be classified for 22-23. And you will either be in the meet requirements. So if you did not receive this formal letter, you meet the requirements. The next level is needing assistance. And so that's that first level of monitoring. After that, we have need intervention, and then finally needing substantial intervention. So on the letter that you've received, just following this description is bolded your actual determination. So it would be within one of the 4 levels. And so that leads to a whole set of activities, which now follows. Our Department of Education uses a 3-tiered model, much like the way we initially started to visualize a RTI tiered system. It has 3 levels within that triangle. And that very first level is universal. And so when we think about a district that has met their compliance and performance requirements, there are still universal strategies and supports, not only through the SELPA, through your County Office of Education, through your own professional development network, to ensure that we're investigating and providing not only that range of FAPE, but a compliant and timely offer of special education services and support. So that's at that universal level. Beyond that, we have a targeted level. So targeted is where we're targeting a specific area or 2 of compliance and or performance. So it could be the dropout rate. It could be the graduation rate. It could be performance in ELA at the elementary level. And so that data is indicated further in the letter, but that would be targeted. And then finally, we have the intensive review. And so that's sort of at the top of the tier. This paragraph describes that for you. And then in the next section, you're going to actually learn what your LEA selection is. So I'll have you scroll up. This one's hard to miss. There's a nice box there with a very specific bolded title. This example, this particular LEA is targeted level 3 for school age. So what this is saying is that there is some data that's been an ongoing concern for this LEA because the levels can be targeted 1, targeted 2, or targeted 3. And then when we get into intensive, another district may have in the same box intensive, and it could be intensive 1, 2, or 3. And there is an indicator of if it's poor performance, for disproportionality, or potentially for school age. And then the link that's highlighted in blue, each of you have access to. That link is live on your letter, and that link will take you to the data sets that led to this finding. So immediately we say, whoa, targeted for dyspro. I wonder where we are disproportionate. The link will take you to the data that shows that. And so hopefully this is something that, we're a week and a half into this. We'd like to bring your attention and make sure all the key folks have access to this information. The superintendent, the special education director, if you've had a team in the past that is engaged in performance monitoring, or just a logical team that you know are going to be working with this is the data that you're going to begin to look at. So I'm going to pause. This is really the general description of here's your level, here's our system, and here's where you fit within our system. Okay, so it's either meets requirements, needs assistance, and then we get into the more intensive levels, and then we have a description of the very specific designation, whether it be targeted or intensive. All right, so when we think about compliance, sometimes folks can easily mistake, and it's understandable with our priorities, but performance monitoring and compliance monitoring. So I think about it as I learn to help people know the difference between an accommodation and a modification. They're not the same thing. They have very distinct purposes and are used in unique scenarios. Same with compliance and performance monitoring. So while John will talk about performance, I'm going to talk about compliance. Compliance has to do with the adults in the building and how the adults are addressing the processes of the IEP. And so do we have systems in place that help us hold timely IEP meetings, that help us assure that the aspects of the IEP, the procedural guidelines for a parent, the translation of documents that is a right of a parent to request, the fact that we actually do search and serve, and we have child find activities through a student study process or other means, all of that has to do with that special education process. Right now, our Department of Education is focusing on one thing. They're not focusing on the whole IEP process. They're focusing on the timeliness of the IEP meeting. And that's not new. That's something that came out the minute we went to a more indirect and home-based virtual instruction through the pandemic. This was something that we were told, this is going to be tough, but we're going to find ways to hold those assessments and to hold those IEP meetings, and we did. And that's still being monitored. So the key areas are outlined in very light bullets in the letter, but they describe the 3 levels of timeline compliance. So the first would be any late IEP or initial assessments. So from the time the parent signed that IEP assessment plan to the time the IEP team met and offered a service of FAPE, if that was late, it would fall under this area of compliance. The second levels have to do with longer than 120 days. So that is seen as a much more significant concern because of the concern of loss of time, loss of offers of FAPE and services for a student that may in fact require services to benefit from their education. So the descriptions are here. And I think more important for today's purpose is as we scroll up, there is another box that will share what the finding is for your LEA. So in that box, you will either have late IEP, initial assessments, or no improvement, or there could be an and no improvement. So if you are a district that has been engaged in monitoring and we're not seeing improvement, you may have an and there. And that's just going to be a critical detail that will help you in your review of your processes. I just want to mention too that we're really fortunate here in our SELPA to have an expert in technical assistance in this area, and Sherry Roberge is with us on this session today because we're working very hard to integrate both program practices and data compliance practices. So this can be a partnership between the folks in your district that pull data reports and hopefully helping you ensure timeliness. So more to come on that. Again, we're going to pivot now into the performance portion of the letter, and I'm going to monitor the chat just so that if there are questions, I make sure we can answer as many as possible today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, John.
Great, thanks. So the first part of the letter is hopefully for a very, very few of you, and that's being identified as SIGDIS or significantly disproportionate. This is a finding that there is overrepresentation by race, ethnicity, and disability categories or discipline and so forth. I'll go through the 5 areas, but just this is a very, very time-consuming and intense and likely multi-year process, and monitored under the intensive monitoring tier. In addition to that, is your special ed funds. 15% of your IDEA funds have to be set aside for CCEIS service, comprehensive coordinated early intervening services, which needs to be essentially spent in preventative measures. And a number of districts have gone through this, and it's, as I said, it's an intense and time-consuming and very, very deep process if you are in SIG-DIS. And the areas for significant disproportionality are disproportionate representation of students with disabilities for suspension, expulsion by duration, setting, and race or ethnicity. Disproportionate representation of students with disabilities by race or ethnicity by placement, that is separate schools, for example, and so forth. Disproportionate representation of students with disabilities by race or ethnicity overall, that is students who have IEPs are qualified as a student with disability if racially or ethnically there is overrepresentation. That would put one in the category. And disproportionate representation within a specific disability category, say emotional disturbance or speech and language or specific learning disability. So those are the 4, and to get into significant disproportionality, it requires being in disproportionality for repeatedly for a period of time. So in any event, it's notifying you if you're on that list. There aren't very many districts that are in this, but more to come. And the technical support and monitoring process through CDE on this, again, is very intense, and you'll be working with specific individuals from the state and consultants in how to get through this process. All right. So next, we wanted to talk about what the letter mentions is some webinars that are required. You're required to attend an informational webinar, and they are listed in the letter at the times. Intensive, significant disproportionality, targeted levels 1 and 2, targeted level 3. And this is if you're out of the lowest level one, the targeted compliance timeliness one. Okay. And a link is provided in there to register for the webinars, all of which we can see that they've passed at this point.
And I might say, if you logged onto the call in our session here right at time, this question came up early, and there will be taped versions of these sent through the SELPA and to you directly if you were required to attend. There is recognition that these dates came out right after you received your letter. And so don't worry about that. We'll make sure that you have access.
We'll get it there. We'll put it also on the website and on our CIM page that we're developing and so forth. So you'll get it. Cool. Good news. All right. Now we wanted to take a little bit of a look at the data. So if you're selected into tiered monitoring, you have access to a data sheet. That's the link that was provided earlier. And it shows your district's performance on, we can push out a copy of this, this annotated letter with the explanations of what things mean and so forth. In addition to that, I'm going to develop a sort of PowerPoint-based video going over the information, hopefully 5-7 minutes, much like with IEP implementation monitoring, and we'll push that out as well, both to help folks who are here, and then if folks weren't able to make it here. All right, so the data sheet is found on the annual determination letter, which is what we were just looking at. And so this is the linked data information. All right. So what it includes is the levels and data. So it includes the monitoring tier and the level. Here we see an example, targeted level 3 for school age. So it's sort of broken up into different areas, as we can see: intensive for preschool age, intensive for school age, targeted for performance for informational purposes only, which I'll talk about in a second, disproportionality, and then significant disproportionality. And repeatedly being in disproportionality will push you into significant disproportionality eventually. So intensive data appears on the LEAs selected for either intensive monitoring or targeted level 3. The targeted performance data is informational only for targeted 3 LEAs because the intensive levels methodology of ranking is used to determine. Basically, and I'm going to go through the ranking system in a second. So for some of the higher levels of monitoring, they take into account a number of factors and compare you against other LEAs in the state to determine what level of monitoring and intervention you need. So for targeted 3, it's only informational just because it's not just based on those numbers alone, whereas in targeted level 1 or 2, it is just based on those numbers alone. And we'll take a look at what some of the categories are. A lot of you may be familiar with them from the annual performance review letters, or annual performance reviews that CDE compiles every year, and dashboard things and so forth. Okay, one other important thing here to mention about if your LEA completed a CIM plan in 2022 and you're implementing in 2023, what you're supposed to do is review the data and then make any adjustments to the existing plan as appropriate, working with your team, and work with your monitoring consultant if you're going to make changes or refinements to your plan. So highly recommend review. If you have one already, highly recommend reviewing it, looking at the current data, and see if you need to make any changes to it. If you do not have a current CIM plan, you're going to have to go through the whole process and starting the SIM process in 2023. Okay, so all phases of the process. Again, if you have an existing one, you're not going to be creating a new plan. You might be adjusting it though. All right. So LEA selected for intensive monitoring or targeted 3 will see a data sheet like this. And I'm going to sort of explain the ranking system. And here we had some indicators. It demonstrates how the LEA performed on various targets and came up with a rank to determine the level of monitoring. I want to kind of go through this example. So the first one we have English language arts, and that's on state testing, and math proficiency among students with disabilities. And then it's a percentage of the students who met the required target. And you see to the right of it, there is a rank. Higher number is better, okay, which means you're closer to the target. The higher the number is, the closer you are to the target, and the lower the number, the worse off you are. So, and in this case, let's look at the least restrictive environment indicators here, 5A and 5B, which is, one is the percentage in Gen Ed for students with primarily Gen Ed placement. And this had 65.79% of students were in regular class or general education 80% or more of the time. Which compared to other LEAs was in the sort of 6th tier or sixth level, 6th score band, if you're familiar with that terminology. Side point here, this is why it's super important that on the Ed settings page that you have those numbers in correctly, the percentage of time in Gen Ed, percentage of time out of general ed. Occasionally, those numbers are flipped. And if they're flipped inappropriately, a couple of those could put you into the monitoring category. So it's worth monitoring that. And then to mention something that we've developed recently and been pushing out is the data analysis tool, which has been, Sherry's been pulling the data and putting it in your folders on a monthly basis right around the first week of the month. I think it'll be coming out next week sometimes. That's a tool on a monthly basis where you might be able to catch some of these things. If you see, okay, this is incorrect, this student is in general ed way more of the time than it indicates here, and make those corrections so you don't end up in monitoring. Okay. And you can see in 5B, which is the higher needs placement, or traditionally a special day class placement ish student. It has regular class less than 40%. You want a small percentage on those. You want a higher percentage on those who are in regular class 80% and more of the time, and a lower percentage on those who are in regular class or general ed less than 40% of the time. And so this sample district here is a rank of 8. So they're doing pretty well. They're not too far from the target. Suspension rate for students with disabilities, again, compared to other LEAs in the state, they're doing reasonably well. And chronic absenteeism rate, and apparently at that 28.5%, 28.5.7%, they're doing reasonably well. So then the way the calculation goes is these numbers are added together and you get your numerator, 35, added these 6 numbers together. And the denominator is 60. That would be the maximum possible score if you had 10s in all area. And this LEA, the sample LEA, ended up with 58.33%. And then you compare this with schools statewide. And if you have scores that fall in the bottom 11 to 20% of scores statewide, you're in targeted 3. And if you're in the bottom 2nd to 10th percentile of scores, you'll be in intensive monitoring. We don't know exactly where the percentage cutoff points and so forth are. But this example school fell into targeted 3. So that is in the bottom 11 to 20% of scores statewide. Now, is that super important to you as you're developing a plan? Only insofar as you can look at the components of why you were pushed into targeted 3 or intensive monitoring, and you can say, okay, math proficiency is one area where we need to work on all these areas, but math proficiency is one area that we really need to work on because we're particularly low in that area. Whereas 5B, we're at level 8. Again, a little bit of work, but the problem is not as severe at that level. So it's good to see the components of how you got into this part of the monitoring process. Okay. And then here we have the table of the various indicators from the dashboard or the annual performance review, and you can take a look at the individual areas, and these might be the components that made up the rank, but no one of these components actually determined it. It was putting it, if you got into targeted 3 or intensive, it was the look at all of them and how close or far away you were to the target. So let's take a look at this. And this is also available again on an annual basis, though it comes out a bit later in the year as the annual performance review. Some dashboard indicators and some come from the annual performance review. We can see here that the sample district did not meet targets in performance on statewide testing in ELA, nor did it in math. And this is again for students with disabilities, and it indicates the target in the column here and where the district here. The target here was greater than very low, and the district was in very low, so they missed the target. And they did okay in everything else, up to higher education, they did not meet the particular target. Yet, again, with all this, the district was pushed into compliance at a higher level because of the ranking of the various factors. To quickly go through these again, we have graduation and dropout rate, which applies to some LEAs and doesn't apply to some LEAs, depending if you're a district that graduates students or high school or unified district. ELA math and ELA academic applies to all districts, and that's students with disabilities taking that. Suspension rates for students with disabilities. I want to point out here too that DisPro looks at some of the same figures, but takes a different lens on it, because in disproportionality, not only are you looking at the overall suspension rate of students with disabilities, but you're looking at what race, ethnicity of the students who are suspended and what rates they are, which is a different lens on this. 5A, 5B, and 5C are, to me, are the least restrictive environment indicators. The first one is your classic RSP general ed placement student in regular class, 80% or more. Again, make sure the numbers on in SACE on the IEP are correct, and also that you're calculating them correctly. There are some nuances to it. Lunch and passing periods, for example, typically count as general ed. In any event, we do have a tool in the document library in SACE for calculating that. And those of you who are in independent study world, it is more complicated. And if you have a good system for that, I'm going to say, let me know, because I've had a lot of questions and discussions from independent study schools on that and how to calculate that. 5B is students who are in regular class less than 40% of the time, and you want a lower number on that. You want to have smaller SDCs. Separate school, in our area, that would be a non-public school or an RTC. That is a student that is a special education school per se. And the 6 indicators are the preschool indicators in this same area. Parent involvement is that checkbox on the IEP that did parents feel like they were involved in the process, included in the process. You're not supposed to pre-populate the box, but really explain to parent what that means, that you're facilitating involvement in it. And then higher education, competitive employment, any education employment are the post-high school outcomes, and why you need to track that. Again, that doesn't apply to all districts, and child find applies to assessment of students and identifying students. So again, all of this, none of this is particularly new information in the CIM process. They're just using it in a little bit different way. Okay. That's the end of my piece on this now. Elizabeth, did we want to open it up to questions at this point?
Yes, and I'm reading through the chat. First of all, thank you, John, for showing and sharing this example. There's a request to share this as a PDF, and I think it's great. I really appreciate the explanations outside of the boxes that could kind of help orient your team if you're going to be engaged in a team monitoring activity. I think this is a great place to start. There are questions around the data and how much data is pulled. We are in the same boat as you at the SELPA in terms of the answers we're getting about that right now. However, I have been told that the technical assistants that each LEA are assigned to, they're often called FMTAs. So the technical assistant guides through CDE will be able to walk each district through their data. And the preference is that someone from the district contact their technical assistant. As your SELPA partner, we'd love to be on a call. If that was a Zoom or just a phone conversation, we're happy to assist if you have questions about the data. If you've been around a while in special education, you know that in the past, there was a window of time when we received the report and the finding, and we had about 20 days to kind of pull our own data and assure that that data made sense for the finding. That process is no longer in existence. And I know some of you have asked for that. And the reason for that is our CalPADS assurances. And it really, again, ties to how important that data review occur at the point that we're monitoring and inputting our CalPADS data at the various points in the year. That's definitely a longer discussion than we want to have today, and one we can have online. If there are some of you out there that are really questioning your data, if you're not sure that this is jiving with how you see your IEPs having unfolded over the last 2 years. Are there other questions? I think we've covered the chat, and so we'd like to open it up for questions.
I see Sonia.
Yeah, it's little old me. I ask all the silly questions. Sorry, everybody. So we're a very big district, Santa Rosa City Schools, so I apologize for that. This statement is around, so I know I can personally go in and get this information off the dashboard and with Sherry's help on all of our sites, but and moving forward and maybe I'm feeling like there's a way to do it, but I'm going to ask the question. Is there a way for me to go in and get information at a glance, like the slide that was just up for individual schools? Or do I have to generate it all and go to the dashboard and here and there? And
I don't think, and Sherry, I think is still here, but I know John can help me with this question. I don't think there is a way to pull data that's going to exactly mimic this letter, but certainly you can look at performance data school by school, and you know this already, right? And you
I was just trying to think of a way
that's a great idea. If there were a program or a request, that's a request I can ask our forms committee with SACE, like that you could pull this report by site. Yeah.
Oh, sure you could. In SACE, yeah. You did, but there isn't an existing.
Every one of the indicators she's talking about.
It would just be really nice to have that.
SACE doesn't have all the
indicator, right, when they're working on their SIPSAs and their LCAPs and their whatever, to say these are the goals that we need to work on as an individual site, right, to maintain it for the district. Anyway, that's thank you.
Making a really important point that Jenny and I have talked about in Ed Services, that we have the LCAP plans and the SIM plan, and knowing that you're in targeted doesn't really tell enough, and it's really what you click on with your data. And so how do we pull and monitor those reports? That's good food for thought. Thank you for that. Good question. Donna.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm at the Monterey Bay Charter School. I have not seen any letters of monitoring yet. And
okay.
I'm not sure why, or if I'm not on the list. And
I will text you privately. So not seeing, we confirmed that all the letters have been sent and we've been CC'd in all of them. So that's probably a very good thing for you, Donna. I think it's safe to share that kind of information. That is a very good thing for you. You will not be engaged in monitoring a year ahead. But again, all this information is relevant because these same data pulls will occur year after year and are related to priorities for student performance.
Oh, well, that's great news. Well, so nothing this year, you're confirming.
Thank you for attending today.
All right.
Any other questions?
Elizabeth, can I respond to Sonia's question? I was doing something else at the time, but you could pull historical data that you've certified and aggregate it by school sites directly from CalPADS. It's not going to have all your indicators, but if you wanted to look at that data, it's easily accessible. And we could definitely work on creating some specific searches that might not meet all of the needs, but could meet some of your needs.
And side point that the SELPA has monthly data for every school LEA in both the county and the charter SELPA for the last 3 years.
Yeah, I started doing that in 2019. So I have a significant amount of data available.
In Excel format It's, as Sherry indicated, we can't get every indicator in there, but if you're looking for school-wide or system problems at a specific school, I think that'd be a great way to do it. I also want to mention here too is that some charter schools are undergoing the SIM process separate from their district, and it's not necessarily the same as those charter schools who are undergoing other processes. It's they pick them somewhat differently, just as a heads up, and that those charter schools would have most likely would have gotten letters directly. So if you're a district working with those, I'm thinking Cali is one of them. And there are a few more. Just make sure that you're coordinating with those folks to go through the process.